Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and for the next couple of weeks we'll be discussing Darnath Lysander's hunt for Warsmith Shon'tu.
Now our story begins when these two first came into contact. You see, when the Imperial Fists deployed to break the 3-year siege of Hadric Tor, a planet in the merciless grasp of the Iron Warrior's Warsmith Shon'tu, it was Lysander who commanded the drop pod assault onto the heights. Having secured the high ground, Lysander's strike force set up teleport homers to summon the Terminators of the First Company into the thick of the fighting. Now, I must also mention at this point in his career, Lysander was the captain of the Second Company. I figured I should add this detail so people don't get confused about the last sentence. Especially because of last time that we discussed Lysander, I mentioned a few times anyways, he is the first captain. But anyways, the teleport for the First Company was a disaster because the Iron Warriors had set a tremor in the warp, and many of the Terminators materialized over deep chasms, or else in solid rock itself. Cletus, captain of the First Company, was one of these. His body reformed around solid stone. Before he died, though, Cletus thrust his relic Thunderhammer, the Fist of Dawn, into Lysander's hands, and bade him seek vengeance through victory. Grasping the hammer with grim determination, Lysander went to work, leading the survivors of the First Company alongside his own to shatter the Iron Warrior's stronghold. Shon'tu fled from the planet in defeat, but he had left a mystery in his wake. Survivors spoke of how the Warsmith had concerned himself little with the desolation of their world, and had instead buried himself in a search through its millennia-old archives. Unfortunately, there was no way to know what Shon'tu had been searching for, as he had destroyed the archives before making his escape. In the reorganization that followed Hadric Tor, Lysander was elevated to the rank of First Captain, Master of the First Company, Overseer of the Armory, and Watch Commander of the Phalanx. Chaplain Shadris, now many centuries old, looked upon the path his recruit had walked, and saw his faith had been rewarded. Lysander seemed certain to rise one day to the supreme rank of Chapter Master, and perhaps lead the Imperial Fist into a new and glorious age. Now, another thing anyways, for those who want to know a little bit more about Chaplain Shadris, feel free to listen to our Vox, Legendary Heroes of the Imperial Fist. When I talk about Lysander there, he's the guy who actually found Lysander on Terra, of all places. But anyways, moving on. Another 2 Terran centuries of honored service as the Master of the First Company awaited him before events conspired to bring about a tragedy. Towards the end of the 40th millennium, Lysander was traveling aboard the Imperial Fist strike cruiser, Shield of Valor, when it was lost in the warp. With him was lost a sizable portion of the First Company. The Imperial Fist waited, hoping for his eventual return, but it was to no avail. For decades and then centuries passed, with no sign of the starship's return to real space. All hope was given up, and Lysander's name was entered on the roster of the chapter's fallen, and his statue placed in the Hall of Heroes in the Phalanx. Yet, Lysander and his crew were not so dead as any supposed. Due to the fickle tides of the warp, the Shield of Valor returned to normal space, nearly 1,000 Terran years later, in 964.M41. However, the location that the Imperial Fists found themselves in was hardly any better. They were located in the outer orbit of the Iron Warriors Traitor Legion's stronghold world of Maladrax, on the western fringes of the Eye of Terror. The Iron Warriors were quick in their reaction, and the firepower of 3 orbital fortresses disabled the strike cruiser. Lysander and a handful of Imperial Fist survivors were easily captured by the Iron Warriors. Lysander's captor, the Warsmith Shon'tu, believed himself a reincarnation of the legendary Dark Age warlord who had borne the same name. He had christened Maladrax after his predecessor's mythical fortress, and, as he went about his bloody tortures, Shon'tu recounted his glorious past deeds, ever boasting of the horrific legends he would reforge. He spoke endlessly of the spear of Hydros, bringer of the swarm, and his search to reclaim the Leviathan war Barku, Tamunash, whose weapons had laid waste to 1,000 worlds, and Shon'tu boasted would do so again. In the hands of their most hated foe, the Imperial Fists were shown no mercy or pity. The Iron Warriors tortured them for weeks, and only the astonishing tenacity of the Sons of Dawn allowed them to survive a full month of incarceration and the tender mercies of the Iron Warriors. Although Lysander's body was bloody and broken, his will remained intact. Throwing off his shackles, he and the handful of Imperial Fist survivors fought their way unarmored and initially with no weapons save for their fury and their fists through the planetary capital, managing to reach a shuttle and escape into the void. Lysander returned to the chapter and was received with great acclaim by his battle brothers and the chapter council, although none of them had even been born when the Shield of Valor had been lost to the warp. His legend remained strong among the Astartes of the chapter, and his actions still provided inspiration to new battle brothers. However, for all this joy at his miraculous return, a deep vein of fear was rooted in the minds of the Imperial Fists that their hero had been corrupted in some way during his time spent in the warp and the dungeons of the Iron Warriors. Lysander underwent 6 solar months of meticulous examination by the Imperial Fist librarians and apothecaries, in which his body and psyche were tested against the chapter's records. Every corner of his soul and every cell in his body was examined thoroughly, leaving no doubt in the minds of his brothers that Lysander was free of any spiritual or physical taint. With thunderous approval, Lysander was ultimately restored to his post as the captain of the First Company. Within 6 solar months of his reappointment, Lysander returned to Malodrax to avenge those lost and his own suffering at the hands of the Iron Warriors. None could stand before the righteous fury of the Imperial Fists as Lysander claimed his revenge. Once Malodrax had been cleansed, Lysander vowed to scour the foul stain of the Iron Warriors from the galaxy once and for all. Yet more importantly, he wished to hunt down and slay Shon'tu. Gathering warriors from across the vast holds of the Imperium, he initiated a crusade against the Imperial Fists, most hated foe that continues to this very day. Though Shon'tu escaped that maelstrom of blood and fire, he did so weakened and beaten. Yet Malodrax was but the start. Lysander's vengeance had only just begun. Following the scourging of Malodrax, Lysander threw himself into the extermination of the Iron Warriors. Within 3 years, the captain had masterminded and led the destruction of 3 other fortress worlds, bordering the Eye of Terror, one of which, the Black Star Redoubt, had ground 3 separate Cadian assaults into bloody paste across the previous solar decade. In his works, Lysander had the vociferous approval of his chapter master, Vladimir Pug, and a tacit devotion from the rest of his battle brothers, which bordered upon worship. Pug was, if anything, slightly wary of Lysander, for he feared that the other might attempt to leverage his reputation in an effort to become the next chapter master. In another man, Pug's concerns might have been the result of ego or pettiness, but such things were entirely alien to his nature. An honest and honorable warrior, even by the exacting standards of the Imperial Fists, Pug would have readily stood aside for a worthy candidate. However, the chapter master could not quite allay his concerns about Lysander, with whom he had clashed on several occasions since his return. Pug found his first captain a little too stubborn, a little too swift to recount the ways in which his experience exceeded that of his chapter master. Every discounting Lysander's lost millennium in the warp, he had nearly a century of experience over any living Imperial Fist. Pug did not wish to fight Lysander's ascension, which he saw was inevitable. He merely wished to delay that day until Lysander was truly ready for the chapter's gilded throne. Pug had always felt that his own ascension had come too early, that the deaths of 170 Imperial Fists in the Boreal planet strike could have been avoided, but for his own stubborn refusal to back down. Pug had learned from that disaster, but considered the price of that wisdom too steep. For his part, Lysander was still coming to terms with life in a new millennium. Much was the same, for the bureaucratic inertia and tradition had made it so, but almost every warrior he had known from before was now dead. Most had perished on the Emperor's battlefields, bringing his vengeance to the enemies of mankind, and Chaplain Shadris had passed on during the siege of Moros, at last having found a foe canny enough to take his life. Joran Makan, Lysander's scout sergeant during his formative years, was now interred within a dreadnought's adamantium sarcophagus, but his mind was so scattered that he no longer recognized his old student. It was a strange time for Lysander, but one thing kept his focus and purpose: hunting down Shon'tu. Such was Lysander's unrelenting ferocity in his pursuit of the Iron Warriors that the Imperial Fists often entered the battle bereft of their first company, which was all too often hammering yet another renegade fortress to dust many light years distant. Other chapters, indeed other chapter masters than Vladimir Pug, might have sought to quell so personal a crusade, lest it overtake a Space Marine's broader and selfless duties. However, the 10,000-year hatred between the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fists was a powerful force, and Pug found it fitting that a part of the chapter's strength was ever dedicated to repaying the slights of the Iron Cage and 10,000 other battles. In any event, Pug could think of no better way to test Lysander's suitability for a more exalted rank. Yet the First Company did not always fight alone. As Lysander's plans grew ever more ambitious, Pug assigned additional forces to his temporary command. At the Revolved Maze, Lysander's strike force consisted not only of the First Company, but also demi-companies from the 2nd and 5th. At the Black Star Redoubt, Pug himself accompanied the 3rd and 9th Companies, content to serve as Lysander's strategic observer, the better to take full measure of his first captain's abilities. Nevertheless, and despite his intended detachment, Pug found himself fighting at Lysander's side in the final assault on the weapon forges. He saw the Fist of Dawn shatter the vast black gates, and cheered as loud as any of his battle brothers as Lysander smote the towering demon prince who served as master of the forge. A day later, when Pug watched from orbit as barrage bombs collapsed the Black Star Redoubt's jagged iron spires, he knew that the time had come. Upon the return to the Phalanx, Pug would step down and take a captaincy. The future of the Imperial Fist would lie in Lysander's hands. But then came the attack on Tallador. You see, the Iron Warriors had not sat idly twiddling their thumbs and toes. An influential new warlord had risen to power amongst Perturabo's sons. With promises of revenge and dark glory, he raised a new army, the Sons of the Forge, from the remnants of warbands crushed by Lysander's hammered blows. No one but this warlord knew why the Manufactorum world of Tallador was chosen, save perhaps an object lesson in needless malice. There was certainly no military goal beyond the stark application of terror, a reassertion of the Iron Warriors' might following a string of defeats. The fleet of gunmetal battleships struck Tallador without warning, pounding the world's defenses into rubble before unleashing wave after wave of dreadclaws onto the planet's surface. Dropships in the shape of tentacled dragons followed, their coiled feelers flailing as they sought purchase amongst the Manufactorium's upper towers. As the vessels settled into position, warpsmiths struck runes of contaminant from the passenger bays, and snarling demon engines spilled into the city streets. Defense commanders mustered what forces they could, but troops recruited to confront the violence of gangs, smugglers, and pirates were of little use against the monstrosities that now tore their regiments to red ruin. Valkyries, operating from hidden air bases on the polar continent, screamed south to engage a second wave of renegade dropships, but were swatted from the sky by the Helldrakes that swooped and dove upon Tallador's volcanic thermals. Tallador Primus, seat of the planetary governor, surrendered after less than a solar day's fighting. Before the week was out, almost all the other cities had petitioned for mercy. Only Tallador Decimus, located in the extreme south, still stood unconquered. Built as it was into the side of an obsidian mountain, its defenses had ridden out the bombardment better than those of its fellows. Any dreadclaw that landed within range of the Decimus's guns were blown apart by shellfire, and any dropship or Helldrake that entered its skies risked obliteration by its impressive array of defense lasers. Yet stalwart as it was, Decimus could not offer assistance to its fellows. Thus did its inhabitants watch helplessly as the Iron Warriors set about enslaving the population, praying all the while that the storm of iron would leave them untouched. In the following weeks, the Iron Warriors wrought great change upon the planet. Tallador Primus was overrun by coiling mecha roots, woven together to form a vast dome structure over the ruins. This had become the Forge Hall, an imposing citadel beneath which the Iron Warriors grafted bond slaves. men and women who had embraced damnation for promises of mechanical apotheosis. They fed the bellowing demon forges night and day. The previous inhabitants, those who still lived, now toiled beneath Tallador's Sextus. This blasted ruin was now little more than a forced labor mining complex, squatting amongst the rubble and supplying precious ores to rapacious warp foundries beneath the forge heart. By the time the Imperium responded, millions had perished in the mines, and the mecha roots had spread to cover almost the entire southern continent. Tallador was well on its way to becoming a new fortress world. Now, Tallador had been under occupation for a little over 2 months when the Space Marines at last arrived. This was not a coordinated counterstrike, but a piecemeal response to Tallador's garbled distress calls. Thus, when the Imperial Fists arrived, they found the world's orbit lit with lance flares and torpedo trails, and an impressive fleet of Crimson Ascillion-class frigates engaging the Iron Warrior's fleet. The Blood Angels' vessels attacked with their customary bravado, ignoring the disparity in size and numbers. Already, one of the Chaos battleships was afire along its lengths, puffs of atmosphere venting as escape pods hurtle out into the void. As Lysander watched from the bridge of the battle barge Storm of Wrath, a cluster of boarding torpedoes struck home against an aft section of the second Iron Warrior ship, and the first captain knew them to contain Blood Angels' boarding parties. A brave but reckless strategy. Deeming that the momentum of the Blood Angels' assault would soon dwindle, Lysander ordered the Storm of Wrath and his support fleet to join the battle. The Iron Warrior's admiral was quick to respond. Like Lysander, he knew that the Storm of Wrath was the single mightiest vessel so far engaged. Its survival or destruction could determine where victory lay. At an unseen command, 3 Chaos heavy cruisers came about on an interception heading, swarms of Helldrakes boiling out of their fighter bays. Ignoring the Blood Angel frigates, they bore down on the Storm of Wrath with violent determination. As the Storm of Wrath's guns fired their first salvo, another force entered the growing battlefield, as the Ultramarine strike cruiser Valen's Revenge burst into real space off the battle barge's port flank. The newcomer fired its prow guns in brief salute, then drove in hard beneath the Storm of Wrath, its dorsal weapon batteries roaring as they obliterated a vanguard wave of Helldrakes. Now, the prudent action for Lysander to have taken at this point would have been to obliterate or repel the Chaos fleet before initiating Planet Strike. However, he quickly decided otherwise. When later recounting the battle to the chapter council, Lysander would cite his concern that every moment of delay was another moment in which the Forge Heart's defense systems would have been brought online. But the truth of the matter was that he had little patience for dueling amongst the stars, whilst the Iron Warrior's grip lay tight about an Imperial world. Ordering the Storm of Wrath into a slow belly roll to bring its deployment chutes into alignment, Lysander left command of the battle barge with its Commodore and ordered his assault force into the drop pods. As the heavy cruisers reached the weapons range and the battle barge's hull began to shudder under shell impacts, the Imperial Fists launched their assault on Tallador. The first wave of the Imperial Fist planet strike came as a storm of barrage bombs and lance strikes. They slammed into the Forge Heart like bolts of divine fury, collapsing sections of the dome to crush the smokestacks and demon forges below. Mega roots flailed like wounded animals, the ends thrashing madly through the bombardment's dust clouds. A few defense batteries returned sporadic fire, but a second bombardment followed hard on the heels of the first, silencing those emplacements. Scores of Iron Warriors and many hundreds of their bondslaves perished in these opening salvos, blown apart by the shockwaves or crushed flat by falling rubble. The planetary assault began in earnest, even as the aftershocks ceased. Lysander had given the honor of vanguard to Vornhagen's 5th Company, and they struck with a precision worthy of Dawn. Drop pods screaming downwards, their retro thrusters pinpricks of brilliant white against an angry red sky. They tore through weakened sections in the Forge Heart's dome, slamming into the rebel-strewn expanse below. The drop pod hatches slammed down as one, and the battle brothers of the 5th Company strode out into the debris-choked air, bolters blazing as they came. An instant later, the air flickered as Captain Lysander and 3 squads of the 1st Company's Terminators teleported into position. Lysander had ordered the rest of the 1st Company, under the command of Honored Sergeant Julian, to capture the slave pens beneath Tallador's Sextus. Lysander was aware that splitting his already outnumbered force was something of a risk, but he had few doubts about Julian's ability, and none at all about his own. The orders had barely left his lips when the counterattack began. Bolt and auto shells streamed from amongst the rubble, every weapon aimed by a hated Iron Warrior, or a zealous bondslave hoping to earn his master's favor. Still, the Imperial Fist came on. Under Lysander's terse commands, they advanced across the shattered tangle of the permacrete and adamantium, disdaining all thought of cover. Heavier weapon fire split the air. Las cannons and plasma guns crewed from the balconies of smoke-blackened spires and gantry lines spitting bright death. Devastators returned fire, missiles and heavy bolter shells hammering at the defenders' positions. A vast stone balcony all but disintegrated under the impact of 2 cracked missiles. As screaming cultists plunged to their death amidst the rubble below, the bodies trampled beneath the advancing Imperial Fists. All at once, the defenders' fire slackened as the bond slaves retreated into the tangle of corridors, leaving their masters to fend for themselves. Not so much as a single Iron Warrior took a step backwards. Planting their feet firmly amongst the wreckage, the traitors taunted their ancient enemies, daring them to come forward and die. The Imperial Fist's response came as another volley of bolt gun fire, the roar of guns drowning out their foes' raucous taunts. Unfortunately, Captain Vogan's third company did not deploy for another quarter of an hour, their launch delayed by a concerted bombing run on the Storm of Wrath. By the time the drop pod smashed home amongst the dead and dying, the battle had moved on. Comm traffic told Vogan that Lysander had moved up into the fortress command spire, and half of the 5th Company had gone with him. The rest, under Hagen's command, had spread out to secure the fortress depths. Bolter fire still raged in the middle distance. The battle was far from over. The further into the Forge Heart the 3rd Company drove, the more twisted the environs became. Gone were the stark lines of the Imperial Manufactorum. Instead, mecha roots pulsed and writhed around pillars fused with metal and flesh. Not all the Tallador's inhabitants had survived to reach the mines. Many, infected by some machine contagion, had become the materials from which the Forge Heart had been fashioned. Their contorted faces stared out from walls, mouths open in silent screams at their horrifying fate. Veteran Sergeant Garradon, Vogan's second-in-command, and the company's most decorated warrior, broke his customary silence as he looked upon these tortured dead and swore to avenge them. Under Vogan's command, the newcomers pushed into the hellish maze of smelting pits and blazing forges. Lysander's trail of destruction was easily found, but following it was another matter. More Iron Warriors were converging on the battle, drawn to Lysander's presence as moths to a vengeful flame. They found the 3rd Company instead, and a vicious running battle broke out amongst the smelting pits. Some of the gantry lines and scaffolds were unstable, and many combatants' battles ended not in glorious volleys of bolter fire, but in the seething pits of molten metal. As the battle raged, a quadrupedal demon engine charged out of the darkness. It leapt high onto the permacrete wall, then pouncing down on the tactical squad Renan. 5 battle brothers went down as the Mauler fiend struck, the survivors hurled away by the beast's flailing tentacles. The demon engine was in motion again even before its victims had hit the ground, pistons driving it towards Captain Vogan. The captain had but a moment before the creature was on him, and it was not enough. Even as Vogan's crackling power fist came around, the Mauler fiend slammed into him. The beast's colossal mass bore the captain to the ground, and Vogan's gauntlet slammed into the side of its armored skull. The blow smashed one of the monster's glittering eyes, leaving a livid scar of ruined metal in its place. The beast barely slowed. With a hiss of pistons, it punched a massive alloy fist down into the captain's breastplate, shattering his power armor and pulping the Space Marine's chest. Vogan died instantly. Tearing his attention from the traitor Marines, Sergeant Garradon barked orders into his comlink. Las cannons blazed, boring deep into the beast's warped metal torso. The Mauler fiend roared in pain and gathered itself for another pounce, but the las cannons flared for a second time, their devastating energy striking with precision and shearing off one of the demon engine's forelegs. With a last terrible roar, the Mauler fiend slumped to its side, oily blood spilling from its wounds. With the demon engine's defeat, the Iron Warrior's determination faded. In ones and twos, they broke off into the darkened corridors, detailing the remainder of Squadron On to carry Captain Vogan's remains back to the drop zone. Garradon assumed command and redoubled the company's pace. At last, after what seemed an age, the third company emerged into the pinnacle of the command spire, or what was left of it. What had once been the planetary governor's palace was now overcome by the coiling corruption of the Iron Warrior's Technarchana. Scattered throughout the alcoves, windows and gateways were vast, coil-encrusted hexagonal pods. At the apex of each, cables pulsed as they delivered vile fluids to whatever lay within. But it was the battle raging at the chamber's heart that drew Garradon's attention. There, amongst the carbon-scored tangle of ruined machinery, some 30 warriors of the 5th Company fought alongside the bulkier Terminator-armored veterans of the 1st. Gunmetal-clad dead were piled deep around them, but there was golden armor too amongst the gray. To Garradon's eye, too many battle brothers had fallen, and more would perish before the battle was done. The Imperial Fists were severely outnumbered, and the air was full of metallic roars of demon engines. In the center of the chamber, Lysander clashed with a hulking figure, clad in what had once been Terminator armor. Now both flesh and armor were merged, a horrific melding of man and machine. This was the warlord of the Sons of the Forge, come at last to face his domain's invaders. Garradon didn't hesitate. With a single barked word of command, he threw the third company into the fray. Lysander saw none of it, for he was lost to the battle with his most hated foe. This was no mere warlord he faced, but Shon'tu, ruler of vile Maladrax. The Fist of Dawn swung about, shattering Shon'tu's left shoulder guard. But still the warlord came on, a leer upon his face, and a demon sword grasped tight in his left hand, knocking Lysander's second blow aside. Shon'tu slammed his unwounded shoulder into Lysander's chest. As the first captain staggered backwards, Shon'tu pressed the fingers of his free hand tight upon his left gauntlet. Responding to the silent signal, the pods lined about the walls cracked open with a flare of greenish gas, and the feeder cables tore free. Metallic roars echoed across the command spire, their timbers somewhat between rage and agony, and scores of glistening demon engines lurched forth into the battle. As Lysander threw himself at Shon'tu once again, his command link crackled into life. The blockade fleet had been driven off, and the Ultramarines had made orbit, and Captain Cato Sicarius was now offering reinforcements. Lysander was incensed. This was the Imperial Fist battle. Honor decreed that they would claim victory from this adversity, as they had many times before. Hagen's forces would soon return from the depths to join the battle, and Perturabo's cursed children would be annihilated. Catching the strike of Shon'tu's demon sword high upon his shield, the first captain angrily refused the Ultramarines' assistance, and fought on. Elsewhere, the newly birthed demon engines had seemed disoriented at first, and this gave Sergeant Garradon some much-needed time to react. The third company was still some distance from linking up with the beleaguered battle brothers, so Garradon ordered his warriors to form a defensive ring in the heart of the nearest courtyard. From this living fortress, his devastators could track and destroy the onrushing demon engines. At least, that was the plan. As his battle brothers took their positions, Garradon saw that these monstrosities were not quite the same as the creature that had slain Vogan. They were incomplete somehow, trailing metal tubing and viscous fluids. Some had stubby, half-formed weaponry. Others had warped and mottled armor, the texture akin to molten wax. They were unfinished, Garradon realized. Shon'tu must have been desperate indeed. But half-forged or no, the newly woken demon engines quickly proved themselves fearsome foes. A roar of engines from the skies above at last denoted the arrival of a flight of Imperial Fist storm ravens. The heavy rasping of their assault cannons, a welcome sound amidst the carnage. The heavy shells tore into the Iron Warriors, driving them back from where the 5th Company, who had accompanied Lysander, stood their ground. But they made little impact on the demon engine's armored hides. With a screech, a helldrake plunged from the bleak skies, its talons tearing deep into one of the storm ravens. Crippled, the flyer plunged groundward, its impact tearing a bloody furrow through the 3rd Company's position. As more helldrakes arrived from the skies, the surviving storm ravens banked away to begin their own fight for survival. Nevertheless, between their intervention and the fortitude of the First Company's Terminators, the Fifth would endure. The same could not be said for those who had thought to rescue them. Its formation shattered by the Storm Raven's impact, the Third Company was being mauled. Fire rained down from all sides, and 24 battle brothers had already fallen. The survivors fought on, teeth gritted against the pain of their wounds, but their foes were too many. A Forge Fiend's autocannons blazed, and 3 battle brothers of Squad Tynon were torn apart. Brother Conrath, the lone dreadnought assigned to the Third Company, turned his multi-melta on the monstrosity and reduced it to steaming slag. But his armor soon buckled as other demon engines returned fire. Rolling gouts of warp energy tore through the Third Company's position, the blistering clouds melting armor and incinerating flesh. Sergeant Garridon, his right arm shattered by an autocannon shell, saw his brothers dying about him and roared defiance. Again, Lysander's comlink crackled into life with an offer of assistance, but again he refused. Hagen, as yet unaware of the situation atop the spire, made no response, but Garridon looked around at the ruin of his battle brothers and came to a rather quick decision. Triggering his own comm, he made formal acceptance of Sicarius' offer. Lysander's bellow of rage flooded the channel and drowned out the Ultramarines' response. Garridon paid it no heed and triggered his teleport homer. A moment later, there was a flicker of motion as some 30 Ultramarine Terminators materialized in the chamber, storm bolters and assault cannons already bellowing their anthem of war. This new arrival marked the last turning point in the battle for Tallador. Shon'tu had no surprises remaining to him, and following Garridon's request for assistance, the forces marshaled against the Warsmith rose steeply. Next to arrive were the Ultramarine Second Company, the Thunderhawk Gladius and Spatha, descending from the skies amidst a whine of turbo laser fire. Hard on their heels, deploying from Storm Raven gunships at breakneck speed, were the vanguard of Captain Tycho's Blood Angels. Where before the Space Marines had been outnumbered, now they had the upper hand. The Ultramarines advanced methodically through the rubble, their line of battle expanding and contracting to match the Iron Warriors' desperate counterattacks. One of Shon'tu's lieutenants, a giant of a man named Marax, took refuge in the remains of the Divinatus Shrine. The brute directed his fellows' fire with such ruthless efficiency that any Ultramarine who approached was all but torn apart. This ended when Tycho loosed the Death Company against the ruins. Seemingly impervious to pain, the black-armored warriors forged on through the storm of fire, hacking at the defenders with chainswords or tearing them apart with their bare hands. Overwhelmed by their fury, Marax's makeshift bastion collapsed. The survivors left to the Ultramarines' guns. By the time Captain Hagen's Demi Company had reached the command spire, the force upon which Lysander had pinned his hopes of victory, the Iron Warriors were in full retreat. Shon'tu, seeing his cause lost, fled and his followers escaped into the tunnels below. It would take many more solar days to fully drive the Iron Warriors from Tallador, and to scour their works from the planet's surface. But no effort was spared until the task was complete. Dozens of traitors and many hundreds of bondslaves were hunted down and slain. But of Shon'tu, no trace could be found. Lysander said little in that time, and spoke not at all of Sicarius or Tycho, instead leaving Sergeant Julian to liaise with what he still saw as unwelcomed allies. Once Shon'tu had fled beyond his reach, Lysander had at last awoken from his vengeful fever, and was forced to confront the cost of his obsession. And it was a high cost. Over 90 of his battle brothers had been slain, including Captain Vogan. Had Lysander waited to make a coordinated assault with the Ultramarines or the Blood Angels, many of those deaths could have been avoided. Worse, had the Ultramarines not intervened, the tally of honored dead would have been much higher. As for Garridon, he and the Third Company played little part in the closing phases of the Talladoran campaign. The apothecaries deemed scarcely a dozen battle brothers of the Sentinels of Terra fit to fight, and the sergeant was not amongst them. Thus, as the Fifth Company aided the Ultramarines and the Blood Angels in scouring Tallador, Garridon endured a frustrating period of convalescence. The inactivity gave him much time to think on the Third Company's fate, and by the time the Storm of Wrath was en route to the Phalanx, Garridon was determined that Lysander's prideful folly would be brought to account. The return of Lysander's strike force to the Phalanx should have been a time for sober celebration, but such was not to be. Shortly after the Storm of Wrath had taken formation with the rest of the Imperial Fists fleet, Sergeant Garradon had requested a private audience with Vladimir Pug, and therein laid bare the story of the Third Company's near demise. Such a meeting was not altogether unusual amongst the Imperial Fists, for the warriors of that chapter have ever held one another to the highest standards of deportment and discipline. Nevertheless, this was not a step that Garradon took lightly. For a sergeant to seek censure of a captain was unusual enough, but to demand it of an honored hero like Lysander? There would be no good outcome from such a challenge. It said much of Garradon's unease at the situation that he had 3 times sought Lysander out during the homeward voyage. He had hoped to see some element of contrition from the captain, some sign that the follies of Tallador would not occur again. Yet, on each occasion, Garradon was angrily dismissed, with Lysander threatening to strip the sergeant of his rank if he persisted. Garradon was perceptive enough to recognize that he was not the true target of the captain's anger, but wise enough to realize that matters had progressed beyond his ability to rectify. Pug, to say the least, was greatly displeased. His ire stemmed not from the sergeant's candor. Indeed, he commended Garradon for speaking on the matter. Nor was the rendition of the Battle of Tallador entirely new to him. Lysander had already given his own account of the engagement, a report that had been scrupulously honest in every detail from the audacious planet strike through to his repeated refusal of assistance. No, what concerned Pug was the fact that Lysander showed no sign of remorse at the outcome his decisions had led him to. The first captain cared only that the Iron Warriors had been defeated and the world returned to the Imperial fold. Pug found this attitude dangerous. There had been triumph at Tallador, true enough, but bought with such needless sacrifice that another dozen such victories would see the glorious traditions of the Imperial Fist ended altogether. Too often had the blood of Dorn guided his children down such a path. The invaders, to name but one of the Imperial Fist successors, ever risked annihilation because of their stubborn refusal to back away from the unwinnable. Moreover, Pug knew that many of the Imperial Fist captains looked to Lysander for example, rather than himself, which could become problematic if the first captain's deeds went unchallenged. After several days of silent meditation and with heavy hearts, Pug convened the chapter council to judge Lysander's conduct. Thus did the 8 surviving captains of the Imperial Fist convene in the shadow-shrouded cloister of remembrance to determine if pride, rather than duty, had come to rule Lysander's actions. This was an old tradition, the captains affirming their obligations beneath the gazes of the honored dead. Golden statues, each many times the height of a man, stood silent in the tiered alcoves that lay around the chamber's circular perimeter. The flickering of the lumen in each alcove seemed to make impressions played upon the statues' faces. Some alcoves were empty, awaiting a battle brother to prove himself worthy of such remembrance. It had been 1,000 years since the last statue had been raised, and a millennium more would march by before the honor was again bestowed. There were no furnishings in the cloister of remembrance, no seats upon which the captains could rest, and no council table to pound in support or detraction of a particular course. Each captain took his place at the room's perimeter, whilst Pug, as head of the council, stood in the center, pacing to address each of his brothers as the need arose. Pug had ordered Garradon's presence as well, and the sergeant now stood in the space set aside for the Third Company's captain. He was soon called upon as a witness to Lysander's part in his company's near demise. Garradon addressed the assembly calmly, for his anger had cooled with the passing weeks. Captain Hagen, commander of the 5th Company, however, was another matter. He had dwelt greatly on the events and come to realize that his own company, though scarred during the Taladoran planet strike, could easily have suffered in the Third's stead. Anger bubbled beneath his otherwise clinical account. Hagen gave projections of what would have happened had Lysander not divided the strike force's companies, and if he had not begun the planet strike until the Ultramarines and Blood Angels could have provided support. Yet it was Lysander's own testimony that was most damning in Pug's eyes, albeit unintentionally. The first captain spoke of the Imperial Fist tradition of sacrifice, of their duty to crush the works of traitors wherever they took root. There could not be, he maintained, too high a price to pay in pursuit of this cause. The Iron Warriors were the Imperial Fist's burden to bear, and their honor to defeat. Without looking at Garradon, Lysander scorned the idea that assistance had ever been required, and moreover suggested that the Ultramarines' arrival had in fact created the distraction which had allowed Warsmith Shon'tu's escape. As Lysander spoke, Poog marked the approving expressions and nods of affirmation given by fully half the captains present. As a mere acting captain, Garradon had no vote upon the council. Lysander's words and demeanor had spoken to the Imperial Fist's selfless and self-reliant traditions, and those captains with whom such things resonated strongest were inclined to overlook where the path had led him. Poog had hoped to salvage some unity from Tallador by demoting Lysander, making him an example of pride gone awry, a lesson for generations to come. The chapter master was certain that the first captain would have recovered from such a blow, and would have even emerged the stronger for it. Such a thing was impossible now, for with the chapter council so evenly divided, an obvious rebuke would cause division. On the other hand, to not act would drive a wedge between Lysander and those captains who disapproved of his actions at Tallador. As chapter master, Poog did not need the consent of his captains to make decisions, but he had long ago learned that leadership was more effective when wielded subtly. Dorn, for all of his forthrightness, had understood that concept, and now Poog resolved to emulate his forefather. Rather than put the matter to a vote, Poog decreed that Lysander would set aside his duties as first captain for a time, and take Vogan's place as commander of the battered Third Company. There was a rebuke in that course of action, for it was an obvious demotion. However, Poog pointed out there was honor as well, and reminded all present that he could think of no one better placed to rebuild the shattered company from its current lamentable state. Lysander's skill as a drill master had not faded since his first days as a sergeant, and there would be much work for him in the rebuilding of the Third. It was one thing to draft replacements from the reserve companies to replenish the Third's losses. It was another thing entirely to expect those warriors to act as a single unit from the very start. Poog furthermore ordered the Sergeant Julian would assume command of the First Company until such time as Lysander's task was complete, though all noted that the chapter master set no time scale under which he expected this to be achieved. Garradon frowned at his chapter master's words, but said nothing. He had hoped that his temporary command of the Third would become permanent, but was incensed that it would pass to the very man responsible for its near destruction. Even Garradon's status as sergeant was now in doubt, for he recalled all too well that his last conversation with his new captain had ended with a threat of sanction. For his part, Lysander was careful to maintain an even tone as he accepted his chapter master's judgment. Moreover, he thanked Poog for the opportunity to forge the Third Company in battle against the Iron Warriors, as he himself had been forged. Shon'tu, Lysander insisted, would at last be brought to account for his crimes. Now, Lysander's expression stiffened noticeably when Poog informed him that the Third Company would not be assigned to pursue the Iron Warriors. Rather, they would prosecute a new campaign, a crusade of thunder, against the orcs of the Magor Rift, whose threat had been growing for several years. Against these foes, the Third Company would hone their skills and prove themselves worthy of the traditions they bore. Lysander looked around the cloister for support, but found none. Without a word, he strode from the room into his new future as the captain of the Third Company. With Poog's edict, Lysander would have to put away his contempt and anger for Shon'tu. For a time. Now, join us next week as we also take a break from trying to find Shon'tu and focus on Lysander's deeds with the Third Company and the Crusade of Thunder. Now, if you enjoyed this box, please like, follow, and subscribe. And if you wish to help us expand our work on 40k lore, by all means support us by joining our membership program on our YouTube channel, Tales of Ashraka. Have a wonderful day, and as always,
until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.